Welcome to the deep dive. We take a stack of sources, articles, research notes, and really plunge in to find the most important nuggets of knowledge for you. Today, we're tackling a fascinating period in recent global trade history. Specifically, looking at how the world reacted to some pretty big shifts in U.S. trade policies. Our sources detail everything from, well, some ambitious goals set in Washington to a surprisingly united pushback from major global players. Our mission today to extract the key insights to understand how a particular U.S. trade strategy, perhaps unintentionally, ended up fostering a kind of global alignment against it. And to guide us through this material, we have our expert.
Great to be here. Yeah, this period is it's a really rich case study in international relations and economics, and the sources, they really lay bare the cause and effect.
Okay, let's jump right in then. The sources point to a really bold statement made early on by the administration, this promise of 90 trade deals in 90 days. That sounds incredibly ambitious. What was the idea behind that, and what did our sources reveal about how it turned out?
That 90 deals in 90 days promise, it was certainly designed to signal a radical departure. The thinking, according to the sources, was to sort of bypass the traditionally lengthy, often very slow-moving process of trade negotiations, and instead rapidly renegotiate or forge new deals perceived as being more favorable to U.S. interests. It was meant to project, speed and decisiveness.
Okay, speed and decisiveness, but how did that actually play out?
Well, here's where the sources really highlight the disconnect. The outcome was stark. Zero such deals materialized within that 90-day time frame, or frankly, for a long time after. The sources argue this failure wasn't just like a missed deadline. It significantly damaged U.S. credibility on the global stage right out of the gate, and it just left trading partners confused about the real path forward.
So the big promise didn't quite deliver. Beyond that initial goal, how did the sources describe the overall nature of the U.S. trade strategy during this time? Was it clear? Predictable?
Quite the opposite, actually. The sources consistently describe the strategy as feeling unclear and incoherent to trading partners. There were frequent, sometimes really abrupt shifts in stance, and significant actions like tariff hikes were often announced unexpectedly, sometimes via informal channels, even social media.
Wow, okay.
Yeah, imagine trying to negotiate a complex agreement when the terms or even the basic approach could just change overnight. This unpredictability, the sources emphasize, made stable, predictable negotiations incredibly difficult for other nations.
Right, it's like trying to build on quicksand. So you have these unfulfilled promises, an unpredictable shifting strategy. How did other countries react? The sources mention a sort of global unity against these policies. What did that look like? Was it like a formal alliance or something else?
Well, what's really fascinating, and the sources bring this out, is that it wasn't a formal treaty or alliance in the traditional sense. It was more of a strong alignment of interests, born out of shared frustration, really, and a common perceived threat to the existing global trade system. You saw major global players, and the sources specifically named Japan, India, the European Union, Australia, and Canada, kind of finding common cause and pushing back against the U.S. approach.
That's quite a diverse group.
Exactly. Despite being incredibly diverse economies, often with competing trade priorities, they coalesced around a surprisingly unified core demand. They wanted a complete rollback of the U.S. tariffs as a prerequisite, a precondition for engaging in any substantive new or revised trade deals. Their collective message was essentially, look, we won't negotiate under duress. And they felt the U.S. unilateral actions were fundamentally undermining the stable, rules-based framework they relied upon.
That solidarity among such diverse players is pretty powerful. Let's maybe dig into the sources' take on the specific motivations for some of these key countries. Starting with Japan, the sources highlight their intense focus on getting U.S. tariffs, particularly on cars, removed. Why was the automotive sector such a central point for Japan?
Well, for Japan, the automotive sector is more than just a major industry. The sources show it's absolutely central to their economic identity and health. It's a massive employer, a huge driver of exports, and really at the heart of their technological innovation. And the U.S. market is, frankly, indispensable for Japanese car manufacturers.
So very high stakes there.
Extremely high stakes. So when the U.S. imposed or even just threatened significant tariffs on automobiles and auto parts, Japan viewed this not just as a trade barrier, but as an existential economic concern. The sources indicate that for Japan, demanding the removal of these specific tariffs wasn't merely a negotiating tactic. It was about defending a vital national interest. Without that precondition met, broader trade talks were, from their perspective, basically a non-starter.
Protecting that core industry makes total sense. Okay, moving to India. The sources suggest their concerns went beyond just tariffs. There seemed to be a deeper sense of perceived U.S. interference. What did the sources detail about that?
Yeah, India's reaction, according to the sources we looked at, was indeed multifaceted. While tariffs were part of the picture, sure, there was this broader climate of what India perceived as inappropriate U.S. actions that really eroded trust. The sources cite instances like the U.S. administration taking credit for India-Pakistan's ceasefire, which India firmly saw as a regional issue, to be handled by the countries involved, and also public, sometimes quite harsh verbal attacks directed at Indian students and companies operating in the U.S.
So it wasn't purely economic then.
Not at all. On the economic front itself, the sources note a general feeling in India of the U.S. interfering in its economic sovereignty. This included perceived pressure on India regarding its trade relationships with other countries, and even pressure related to its domestic economic policies. So this accumulation of grievances, the sources suggest, built a level of distrust that made India more receptive to aligning with other nations who were also seeking a more predictable and, frankly, less interventionist global system.
It's interesting how actions outside of direct trade policy can really color the entire relationship. What about the European Union, their traditional U.S. allies? How did they navigate this, and what was their core position, according to the sources?
The EU, well, they found themselves in a difficult spot, really, caught between its historical alliance with the U.S. and its foundational commitment to free trade and multilateralism,
Right.
which means, resolving disputes through negotiation and bodies like the WTO to the World Trade Organization.
Right.
So the U.S.'s unilateral imposition of tariffs, famously on steel and aluminum, directly challenged these core EU principles.
So how did they respond?
The sources describe the EU's response as sort of two-pronged. First, they implemented retaliatory tariffs on a range of U.S. goods. That was a clear signal that U.S. actions would have consequences. Second, they consistently called for the U.S. to remove its tariffs and return to the negotiating table. The EU was trying to de-escalate while simultaneously highlighting that the U.S. actions weren't just impacting European businesses. They were seen as damaging the integrity of the global trade order that both the U.S. and the EU had helped build over decades.
And Australia used some particularly strong language, didn't they? Describing the U.S. tariffs as economic harm and even self-harm for the U.S. itself. How did the sources explain that idea of self-harm?
Yeah, that economic self-harm point is one that really resonates in the analysis we reviewed. Australia, like many trading nations, is highly dependent on predictable international trade. They saw these tariffs as fundamentally disruptive. The self-harm argument, as articulated in the sources, is basically this. While tariffs might offer short-term protection for certain domestic industries, they often lead to higher costs for a country's own consumers and businesses, because imported components or goods just cost more.
Makes sense.
And furthermore, they trigger retaliation from other countries, which then harms the imposing country's own exporters. They also disrupt these complex global supply chains that U.S. businesses themselves rely on. So Australia's point, backed by the sources, was essentially that these policies weren't just hurting trading partners. They were actively undermining America's own economic efficiency and its global standing.
And finally, Canada. A very close neighbor, a major steel exporter. They were right in the middle of renegotiating NAFTA into the USMCA at this time, which must have been incredibly complicated by all these tensions.
Oh, absolutely. Canada was in a uniquely difficult position. As a huge exporter of steel and aluminum to the U.S., they were directly and significantly impacted by these tariffs, often justified on grounds like national security, that Canada and others found pretty questionable.
Right, during the NAFTA talks.
Exactly. The sources highlight how this occurred right in the middle of the very sensitive process of renegotiating the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, into what is now the USMCA, the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement. The imposition of tariffs on a close ally during this critical negotiation period just complicated things immensely. It was perceived by many Canadians as an aggressive tactic against a trusted partner, severely straining the relationship. And it really underscored the disruptive nature of these policies, even with immediate neighbors tied together by such deep economic links.
So across these diverse nations, we see this shared experience of unpredictability, unilateral action, and this feeling that the established rules were being sidelined. The sources also mention a perceived historical pattern, perhaps like the U.S. approach with Japan around 2020, where it seemed the U.S. would sort of create a problem and then claim to solve it without fundamentally changing things. What did the sources mean by that critique?
Yeah, this critique appears in the sources multiple times. And it speaks to a perception of a strategic pattern or maybe a tactic. The idea is that the administration would sometimes initiate a trade dispute or impose tariffs, effectively creating a crisis or a leverage point. Then later, they would announce a deal or a resolution that was presented domestically as this big win. But upon closer examination, it didn't necessarily offer substantial new market access or benefits for the trading partner. Sometimes it just walked things back.
Like the Japan example.
Exactly. The 2020 U.S.-Japan mini deal is often cited in this context. Critics, as noted in the sources, argued that while it was framed as a positive new agreement, it largely just restored the market access that Japan had already enjoyed under the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TPP, which of course the U.S. had withdrawn from earlier. The concern highlighted is that this pattern erodes trust. Trading partners begin to wonder if they are engaging in good faith economic negotiation or if they are just part of a staged event, primarily for consumption back in the U.S., and that makes genuine, long-term agreements much harder to achieve.
That makes sense. If partners feel they're just part of a show, it's tough to build real bridges. And there was another irony the sources pointed out. The U.S. Treasury Secretary at the time criticized the EU for not having a unified negotiating position, which the sources argued was actually more applicable to the U.S. side itself. What was the dynamic there?
Oh yeah, that's a striking point of irony highlighted in the analysis we reviewed. The U.S. administration during this period often presented a, well, fragmented front on trade policy. You had different key officials, the president, the U.S. trade representative, the Treasury Secretary, various economic advisors, sometimes appearing to voice differing priorities or approaches. It created confusion about the actual U.S. position or its long-term goals.
So not exactly a united front internally.
Precisely. So when a U.S. official publicly criticized the European Union, an entity that, despite being made up of 27 member states, generally strives very hard to present a single, unified voice in trade negotiations for lacking unity, it struck many observers, as the sources point out, as a classic case of the pot calling the kettle black.
Yeah.
This internal lack of coherence within the U.S. side, the sources suggest, likely made its own negotiating efforts less effective and further complicated things for its international partners.
Okay, so considering all these factors, the global pushback, the specific grievances, the perceived incoherence in these patterns, what do the sources suggest are the lasting effects or the key lessons learned from this period of intense trade tension?
Well, the sources outline several pretty significant long-term implications. Firstly, this period undeniably accelerated the trend of countries and businesses seeking to diversify their global supply chains. Having experienced the vulnerability of reliance on a single partner, including the U.S., they began actively looking to reduce that risk, spreading their bets, so to speak.
Makes sense, reducing risk.
Secondly, it spurred many nations to double down on creating trade stability elsewhere, often by pursuing major regional trade agreements without the United States. We saw increased momentum behind deals like the CPTPP, the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, or the RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership in Asia, essentially creating alternative frameworks for a predictable trade.
So kind of bypassing the U.S. system.
In a way, yes. Thirdly, this period arguably eroded trust in the U.S. as a consistently reliable leader and partner within the global economic system. And relatedly, it weakened multilateral institutions like the WTO, which the U.S. often bypassed or openly challenged. The core lesson, according to the sources, seems to be that while addressing legitimate trade imbalances is a valid goal, how you go about it is paramount. Unilateralism, unpredictability, and alienating allies can be deeply counterproductive. A more strategic, coordinated approach, built on collaboration with allies, is likely far more effective and sustainable in navigating these complex global trade challenges.
It really seems the sources paint a picture where U.S. trade policies, perhaps aiming to gain leverage by acting unilaterally, inadvertently fostered this powerful sense of solidarity among diverse nations. They weren't just passive recipients, they actively pushed back, often uniting and demanding a return to more stable, rules-based international trade.
That's absolutely the key takeaway from the analysis, I think. It really highlights the agency of other nations. They aren't just waiting around to see what happens. They have their own vital interests, their own viewpoints, and they are capable of forming broad, sometimes surprising coalitions when they feel fundamental principles of global trade stability are being threatened.
This has been a truly insightful deep dive into a critical recent period in global trade relations. Thank you so much for walking us through the sources and extracting these key insights.
My pleasure. It's a fascinating topic.
And thank you for joining us for this deep dive. As you think about what we've discussed today, maybe consider this. How might the alliances formed, the distrust perhaps sown, and the alternative trade frameworks developed during this period continue to shape global trade dynamics, or maybe influence the role and effectiveness of institutions like the WTO in the years ahead? Goodbye for now.